Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The October evening wrapped Hogwarts in a soft golden veil as the last rays of sunlight pierced through the tall windows of the Great Hall. Candles had already flickered to life above the tables, casting warm reflections on the ancient stone walls, while the aroma of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the air with the promise of a cozy evening. The leaves beyond the windows rustled gold and crimson, as if nature herself was preparing for winter's long tale. At the Gryffindor table sat an unusual trio of fifth years, who seemed more interested in each other than in the traditional division by houses. Thomas Winterbourne, a tall Gryffindor with chestnut hair and brown eyes that always gleamed with a hunger for adventure, nervously twirled a spoon in his hands, occasionally glancing towards the staff table. Beside him sat Selena Ravenscroft from Ravenclaw, a slender girl with long black hair gathered in a high ponytail, whose gray eyes seemed to always be analyzing something. On the other side sat Edgar Tudge from Hufflepuff, a sturdy young man with sandy curls and kind green eyes, who was currently trying to calm his friend Thomas. "Tom, stop staring at Professor Dumbledore like that," Edgar whispered, carefully looking around. "People will start to notice." "He's right," Selena supported, not looking up from her plate of stewed vegetables. "Your behavior is far too obvious. If you truly want to investigate these rumors, we need to act more thoughtfully." Thomas finally tore his gaze from the staff table, where Professor Dumbledore was dining peacefully, occasionally smiling at something Professor McGonagall was saying. The headmaster looked particularly elegant this evening. His long silver beard was carefully combed, and his half-moon spectacles glinted in the candlelight. "Listen," Thomas said, leaning closer to his friends and lowering his voice to barely audible whisper. "During Transfiguration today, I heard Marlene McKinnon telling Lily Evans about how her older sister, who graduated 3 years ago, once heard from the Fat Friar about some mysterious rooms that Dumbledore himself created. And what's supposed to be there?" Selena asked, finally raising her eyes and looking at Thomas with that characteristic Ravenclaw expression when they're evaluating whether information is worth their attention. "Here's where it gets interesting," Thomas continued, his eyes blazing even brighter. "Different sources tell different stories. Some say magical artifacts are stored there, collected by Dumbledore during his many years of travel. Others are convinced it's a library containing the rarest and most powerful spellbooks. And then there are those who believe something related to alchemy is hidden there. After all, everyone knows Dumbledore worked with Nicholas Flamel." Edgar chewed his honey-covered porridge thoughtfully, frowning. He had always been drawn to mysteries, especially those concerning the history of Hogwarts, which he loved more than anything else in the world. "Didn't Professor Binns tell us that Dumbledore became headmaster back in the 1950s? He said slowly. "That means he's been here for more than 20 years. In that time, one could accumulate truly impressive things." "That's exactly what intrigues me," Thomas admitted, setting down his spoon and leaning even closer. "Think about it. A man who defeated Grindelwald, who knows the deepest secrets of magic, who is considered one of the most powerful wizards of our time. What might such a person keep in secret chambers of the castle?" Selena silently listened to conversations at neighboring tables, her sharp mind automatically filtering information. Suddenly she noticed that several Slytherin students, particularly Lucius Malfoy and his closest friends, were also discussing something animatedly, occasionally glancing towards the staff table. "We're not the only ones interested in this matter," she quietly informed her friends. "Look at the Slytherins. Lucius looks far too interested for an ordinary dinner." Thomas carefully looked around and saw that Selena was right. Lucius Malfoy, an aristocratic blonde with cold gray eyes, was indeed actively discussing something with his companions, and his gaze also periodically stopped on the headmaster's figure. "This convinces me even more that we're on the right track," Thomas whispered. "If Malfoy is also looking for something connected to Dumbledore, it means the matter is more serious than just student rumors." The great bell rang over the castle, announcing the end of dinner. Students began rising from their seats, preparing to disperse to their common rooms. The noise of conversations and clinking dishes filled the great hall, creating perfect cover for important discussions. "Meet at midnight in the library," Thomas quickly whispered, gathering his things. Selena, can you slip out of Ravenclaw Tower unnoticed? I have several ideas, the girl replied with a slight smile. And you, Edgar? Your house is closest to the kitchens, so Filch rarely patrols those corridors late at night. I can slip out unnoticed, Edgar assured, though notes of anxiety could be heard in his voice. But what will we do in the library at midnight? Mr. Filch will be patrolling, and Mrs. Norris has extraordinarily keen senses. Selena knows the library best, Thomas said, indicating the girl with his gaze. She'll find us a safe place for initial research. For now, we need to determine if there's any documentary evidence of these rumors. They carefully separated in different directions, trying not to attract attention. Thomas went to Gryffindor Tower with other students from his house, but his thoughts were already focused on the upcoming nocturnal adventure. The castle corridors gradually quieted, leaving only the distant sound of wind beyond the windows and the soft footsteps of those who had not yet gone to bed. In the Gryffindor common room, cozy chaos reigned. The fireplace crackled merrily, casting rosy reflections on the red velvet armchairs and golden drapes. Several younger students were still playing Exploding Snap by the fire, while older students gathered around tables, preparing homework. Thomas pretended to read his defense against the dark arts textbook, but was actually pondering his plan of action. A few corridors away in Ravenclaw Tower, Selena sat by her own fireplace, absorbed in a thick volume of Hogwarts, a history. But her attention was focused not on the official version of events, but on what might have remained undocumented. She recalled all the conversations she had ever heard about the headmaster, all the strange details in his behavior that might hint at the existence of secret rooms. Meanwhile, Edgar in the Hufflepuff common room was helping a first year with a history of magic essay, but his thoughts wandered through the castle's stone corridors, imagining all the possible places where a person with Dumbledore's mind might hide something important. The Hufflepuff basement quarters gave him a special perspective on the castle's architecture. He knew about the existence of countless secret passages and forgotten rooms that other houses might not even suspect. When the clock struck 11, Thomas began preparing. He carefully pulled his invisibility cloak from under his bed, a winter-born family heirloom passed down from generation to generation. The cloak wasn't as perfect as those described in legends, but it was quite suitable for ordinary nocturnal adventures. Selena, meanwhile, used a much more refined approach. She applied sound-muffling charms to her shoes and light disorientation spells that would confuse anyone trying to track her path through the corridors. Ravenclaws always preferred to rely on intellect and magic rather than magical artifacts. Edgar chose the simplest but no less effective method. Hufflepuffs knew all the best routes through the castle, especially those used by house elves. He simply crept through the underground corridors that led from the kitchens to various parts of the castle, using knowledge accumulated over 5 years of friendship with the cooks. At midnight, the three friends appeared almost simultaneously at the library entrance. Selena was already waiting for them, pressed against the shadow of a large column, while Thomas and Edgar approached from different sides, like shadows in the night castle. Madame Pants always locks the library with a special charm, Selena whispered, carefully touching the wooden doors. But I studied it last year when working on a project about ancient runes. She drew her wand and whispered several words in Latin mixed with Elvish runes. The doors opened soundlessly, letting them into the library's darkness. Inside, a special atmosphere reigned, the scent of old parchment and leather bindings mixed with a light aroma of lavender oil that Madame Pants used to care for the most precious books. Tall shelves rose into the darkness like walls of an ancient temple of knowledge, while moonlight filtering through large windows created whimsical shadows between the rows of books. "We need the castle history section," Thomas whispered, looking around. "If Dumbledore really created secret rooms, there must be some record, some hint." "Not just official history," Selena added, leading her friends between the shelves. "We need to look for private diaries, memoirs of former students, perhaps even letters. People always record what impresses them, even if they don't understand the true significance of what they've seen." They reached the far corner of the library, where the oldest and rarest books were kept. Here the air was even thicker with the scent of centuries, and each book seemed to whisper its secrets in the night silence. Selena lit a small magical lantern that gave soft, barely perceptible light, sufficient for reading, but not bright enough to attract attention. "Look," she whispered, pulling a thin volume in a faded green cover from the shelf. "Memoirs of a 1952 graduate. That's exactly when Dumbledore became headmaster." Edgar carefully took the book and opened it to a random page. The handwriting was neat but somewhat faded in places, and some pages had yellowed with time. "There's something here," he whispered, moving his finger along the lines. "The new headmaster spends much time in the eastern part of the castle, where none of us had seen him before. They say he personally oversees the renovation of several rooms, and even the professors don't know what's happening there." Thomas felt his heart begin to beat faster. This was their first real clue. "Eastern part of the castle," Selena repeated thoughtfully. "There are several towers there that are rarely used and old classrooms. It would be an ideal place to create something secret." Suddenly they heard a distant sound. It was the metallic jingle of Mr. Filch's keys echoing through the stone corridors, approaching the library. The three friends instantly froze, hiding in the shadows between the shelves. Their hearts were pounding so loudly it seemed this sound might give away their location. Filch's footsteps stopped right at the library doors. After a moment, the caretaker's creaky voice rang out. "Mrs. Norris, are you sure you heard something suspicious here?" The silence stretched for long, unbearable seconds. Finally, the footsteps moved away down the corridor, but the friends didn't dare move for several more minutes. "We'd better go," Edgar whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. "If Filch suspects something, he might return with additional security measures." "Agreed," Thomas supported. "But first let's take this book. It might contain more useful information." Selena carefully hid the volume under her cloak and checked that they hadn't left traces of their presence. Then they left the library as silently as they had arrived, dispersing by different routes to their common rooms. In his bed, Thomas couldn't fall asleep for a long time, turning over the found information in his mind. Eastern part of the castle, mysterious renovations. What could have interested Dumbledore so much that he personally dealt with this matter? And why didn't even the professors know the details? Selena, meanwhile, had already composed a preliminary research plan. They needed to find more evidence of Dumbledore's activities in the early years of his headmastership, and also investigate the architecture of the castle's eastern part. Perhaps old castle blueprints or architects' diaries would contain clues. And Edgar, falling asleep, thought about how dangerous what they were seeking might be. Dumbledore was a person of enormous power and knowledge. If he had decided to hide something, there were probably serious reasons for it. Were they ready for what they might find? Beyond Hogwarts windows, the October wind rustled through the fallen leaves, as if whispering the castle's ancient secrets that waited for their discoverers. The next day began with a gray morning as mist slowly rose from Hogwarts Lake, wrapping the castle in a milky haze. The October air smelled of damp leaves and smoke from the kitchen chimneys, where the house elves were already preparing breakfast. The three friends met for breakfast in the great hall, trying to maintain their usual appearance, though each of them had barely slept due to excitement from the previous night's discovery. Thomas sat at the Gryffindor table, but his attention constantly slipped to Selena at the Ravenclaw table and Edgar at the Hufflepuff table. They had agreed to exchange glances as signals. Selena was to investigate the library more thoroughly. Edgar planned to question Professor Kettleburn about the castle's history, and Thomas himself decided to try extracting information from Professor Slughorn, who had worked at Hogwarts even before Dumbledore's appointment as headmaster. After breakfast, each of them went their separate way. Selena was first to head to the library, where Madame Pants was already arranging books returned during the night. The Ravenclaw chose the tactic of open research. She took several books on magical history and settled at her favorite table by the large window, from which the eastern part of the castle was visible. "Good morning, Madame Pants," Selena greeted politely when the librarian passed by her table. "I'm working on a research project about architectural changes in Hogwarts over the past 30 years. Could you recommend additional sources?" Madame Pants, a thin woman with sharp features and a stern gaze, stopped and looked at the girl attentively. As always, she was dressed in a dark dress with a high collar, and her gray hair was tightly gathered in a bun. "Architectural changes?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Interesting topic for a fifth year. What exactly interests you?" "I've noticed that some parts of the castle look different in old and new portraits," Selena answered carefully. "Especially the eastern part. I'm curious to understand when and why these changes occurred." Madame Pants looked at Selena for a long time, as if trying to understand the true motives of her interest. Finally, she nodded. "We have an archival section," she said. "Old castle plans are stored there, correspondence with the ministry about renovation permits, as well as diaries of some former caretakers. But only students who have received special permission from their head of house have access there." I'll certainly speak to Professor Flitwick, Selena assured her. And for now, perhaps you could recommend something from publicly available sources? Madame Pants led her to a special section where historical documents were kept. Here the air was even more saturated with the scent of antiquity, and each book seemed to hold within itself the echoes of centuries. Selena pulled out several volumes and began methodically reviewing them, taking notes in her notebook. Meanwhile, Edgar was heading to the greenhouses, where Professor Kettleburn spent his morning hours tending to his magical plants. The path to the greenhouses led through the grounds, where the October air was particularly fresh and clear. Edgar breathed deeply, trying to calm his nerves before the conversation with the teacher. Professor Kettleburn, an elderly man with a long gray beard and kind blue eyes, was working near an enormous mandrake, carefully pruning its leaves. He wore an old protective apron covered with stains from various magical fertilizers, and his hands were protected by thick leather gloves. "Ah, Mr. Tudge," the professor smiled, noticing the Hufflepuff. "Early today. Something particular interests you in the world of magical botany." "Good morning, Professor," Edgar replied, trying to sound casual. "Actually, I'm interested not so much in the plants as in the history of the greenhouses themselves. I noticed that some of them look much newer than others." Professor Kettleburn set down his secateur and turned to the student, a spark of interest appearing in his eyes. "Observant," he nodded approvingly. "Indeed, some greenhouses were added relatively recently. When Professor Dumbledore became headmaster, he initiated several projects to expand the castle's educational facilities." "And what exactly was added?" Edgar asked, trying not to show excessive interest. "Oh, it was an ambitious program," the professor recounted, obviously pleased to have the opportunity to share memories. "New greenhouses, additional laboratories for potion making, expansion of the hospital wing, and of course, some special rooms whose purpose only the headmaster himself knew." Edgar's heart quickened. This was exactly what they were looking for. "Special rooms?" he repeated carefully. "Yes, I remember there was much commotion around the eastern part of the castle," the professor continued, returning to his mandrake. "Workers were building something there for entire weeks, but even we teachers weren't allowed to enter. Professor Dumbledore personally supervised the work. And you don't know what might have been there?" Edgar couldn't resist asking. Professor Kettleburn pondered, frowning. "There are various theories," he said finally. "Some colleagues believe it's additional storage for dangerous magical artifacts. Others think it's a secret laboratory for alchemical experiments. And Professor Flitwick once jokingly suggested that the headmaster simply created a private library for the rarest books." Meanwhile, Thomas was trying to catch Professor Slughorn after the potions lesson. Horace Slughorn was a fat, cheerful man with a bald head and a walrus mustache, who loved to surround himself with talented and promising students. Thomas knew that the best way to get the professor talking was to attract attention with his knowledge. "Professor Slughorn," Thomas addressed him after the lesson ended, when other students had already dispersed. "I have a question about the application of valerian tincture in combination with mandrake root." Professor Slughorn's eyes gleamed with pleasure. He adored it when students showed deep interest in his subject. "Excellent question, my boy," he nodded approvingly. "It's a very complex combination that requires careful dosing. But what exactly interests you?" "I read that such a combination can be used to create enhanced calming potions," Thomas replied. "And I became curious whether any of our teachers practice such complex recipes." "Oh, certainly." Professor Slughorn settled into his chair, obviously ready for a long conversation. "Professor Dumbledore, for example, has considerable talents in potion making. When he first became headmaster, we often discussed various recipes. I remember he was interested in potions that help preserve magical artifacts." Thomas felt adrenaline quicken his pulse. This was another confirmation of their theory. "Preserve artifacts?" he asked, trying to sound merely interested. "Yes, there are special potions that can slow the degradation of magical objects," the professor explained. "Very useful for collectors or, well, for people who store many valuable things." By lunch, the three friends met in an empty classroom on the 4th floor, where astronomy lessons usually took place. From here, an excellent view of the castle's eastern part opened up, and they could peacefully share the gathered information. "I have concrete facts," Selena began, pulling out her notebook. "In 1956, a year after Dumbledore's appointment as headmaster, an official request was submitted to the ministry for permission to renovate the eastern part of the castle. The documents only mention expansion of educational opportunities, without details. And I have confirmation from Professor Kettleburn, Edgar added. He personally saw the construction work and confirmed that even teachers didn't have access there during construction. Professor Slughorn told me something very interesting, Thomas said. Dumbledore was interested in potions for preserving magical artifacts. This means he planned to store something valuable and wanted it not to degrade over time. Selena looked thoughtfully out the window, where October wind was majestically scattering fallen leaves beyond the glass. We need more specific information, she said. I can try to get access to the library's archival section, but that requires Professor Flitwick's permission. What if we try an alternative approach? Edgar suggested. We have divination class with Professor Tremaine today. Maybe try fortune-telling? Thomas looked skeptically at his friend. Divination isn't the most reliable way to get specific information, he noted. But if nothing else works, worth trying, Selena supported. Sometimes intuition can point the way when logical analysis reaches a dead end. The divination lesson took place in the castle's highest tower, where Professor Tremaine, an eccentric middle-aged witch with long gray hair and many bracelets, taught students various methods of predicting the future. The classroom was darkened, lit only by candles, and the air was saturated with the aroma of sandalwood and lavender. Today we'll be working with crystal balls, Professor Tremaine announced in her always somewhat mysterious voice. Remember that true divination requires not only technique, but also openness of mind to the subtle vibrations of the universe. Selena, Thomas, and Edgar sat together at a small round table on which stood a medium-sized crystal ball. They agreed that each would take turns trying to see something connected to their search. Selena tried first. She placed her hands on either side of the ball and concentrated, trying to clear her mind of all thoughts except one question. What does Dumbledore hide in the eastern part of the castle? At first there was nothing in the ball but milky white mist. Then gradually unclear images began to appear. Selena saw a long corridor illuminated by golden light, whose walls were decorated with strange symbols. At the end of the corridor stood large oak doors with an unusual lock shaped like a sun? No, something like a sun, but with many rays. I see a corridor, she whispered without opening her eyes. Golden light, symbols on the walls, doors with a lock shaped like a sun or star. Suddenly the image vanished, and the ball became clear again. Interesting, Thomas muttered. Let me try. He concentrated on the same question, but his vision was completely different. He saw a large room filled with rows of wooden shelves, but on them stood not books, but jars? Boxes? Something round and colorful that sparkled in soft light. I see some kind of storage room, Thomas recounted. Many shelves with round objects, they're colorful and sparkling. Finally, it was Edgar's turn. His vision was the most enigmatic. He saw a figure in a long robe standing with its back to him in a large room. The figure was arranging something on shelves, moving very carefully and cautiously. Suddenly the figure turned, and Edgar saw gleaming half-moon spectacles and a long silver beard. I saw Dumbledore, he whispered. He was arranging something in a large room, very carefully, as if it were very precious. Professor Tremaine approached their table just as they finished sharing their visions. Interesting results, she observed, looking carefully at the ball. Your images have common elements, that's a good sign. It means you're tuned to the same wavelength. And what might this mean? Thomas couldn't resist asking. A corridor with symbols usually indicates a place protected by ancient magic, the professor explained. A storage room with colorful objects might symbolize preserved knowledge or gifts. And a figure carefully arranging something speaks of the object of search having great personal significance for this person. After the lesson, the three friends met in an empty classroom to discuss the obtained results. The images are very vivid, Selena said, and they all point to the fact that what we're looking for really exists. But how do we find this corridor with symbols? Edgar asked. The eastern part of the castle is quite large. We need to conduct reconnaissance, Thomas said decisively. Tonight I suggest we explore the eastern part of the castle directly. That's dangerous, Edgar reminded. Filch has increased patrols after yesterday's suspicions. That's why we need a detailed plan, Selena supported. And better preparation. I can create a map of the castle's eastern part based on the plans I found in the library, and also prepare several useful spells. And I can scout Filch's patrol routes, Edgar suggested. The house elves in the kitchens know his schedule better than anyone. Then it's agreed, Thomas said. Tomorrow evening we meet here at 11 o'clock. Until then, everyone prepares as thoroughly as possible. The evening found them in intensive preparation. Selena stayed in the library until closing time, copying fragments of old castle plans and studying spells for silent movement. She also found interesting information about protective charms, usually used to guard valuable things. Edgar spent the evening in the kitchens, helping the house elves and unobtrusively asking about Mr. Filch's habits. He learned that the caretaker always began his night rounds from the dungeons, then moved to the first floor, and only after that went upstairs. He usually checked the castle's eastern part between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. Thomas, meanwhile, studied his collection of spells inherited from his older brother, who had graduated from Hogwarts several years ago. He found several useful charms for distracting attention and concealing the sound of footsteps. In the evening, lying in their beds, each of them thought about tomorrow night. This was to be their first real attempt to find Dumbledore's mysterious treasures. And although all three were worried, their determination only grew with each new clue found. Beyond Hogwarts' windows, the October wind sang its eternal song, and the moon rising over the castle promised to illuminate their future adventure with mysterious silver light. At midnight, Hogwarts Castle transformed into an entirely different place. The corridors that during the day hummed with the voices of students and professors now lay in deep silence, broken only by the distant howling of wind and the quiet crackling of dying torches. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, painting whimsical patterns of shadows from the latticed frames on the stone floor. The air was cool and smelled of antiquity, wax, and the barely perceptible aroma of magic that always accompanied the castle's ancient stone walls. Thomas was first to slip from Gryffindor Tower, carefully passing the portrait of the fat lady, who was sweetly snoring in her pink armchair. His invisibility cloak rustled barely audibly, and his heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed the entire castle must hear this sound. He moved through familiar corridors, avoiding squeaky floorboards and places where stone slabs might betray his presence with dull footstep sounds. Selena chose a much more refined approach. Instead of creeping through corridors, she used one of Ravenclaw Tower's secrets, a hidden passage that led from their common room through old ventilation shafts to the castle's central part. This route was known only to the most devoted researchers of the castle's history, and Selena had studied it in her 3rd year. She moved absolutely silently, using muffling spells she had learned the night before. Edgar, as planned, used the underground corridors connecting the Hufflepuff basement with the rest of the castle. These passages were used mainly by house elves, so he was confident he wouldn't encounter Filch here. The corridors smelled of freshly baked bread and gingerbread from the kitchens, and the walls were warm from the ovens that worked around the clock preparing food. The agreed meeting place, the astronomy classroom on the 4th floor, had not been chosen randomly. From there, the best view of the castle's eastern part opened up, and besides, Professor Sinistra usually didn't conduct observations on cloudy nights, and today the sky was covered with thick autumn clouds. When all three finally gathered in the classroom, the clock on the main tower struck 12. Selena spread out on the table a detailed map of the castle's eastern part, which she had compiled based on old plans and her own observations. "Look," she whispered, pointing her wand at different parts of the map. "The eastern part has 3 main levels. On the 1st floor are old classrooms, most of which are no longer used. On the 2nd, former guest rooms for castle visitors. And on the 3rd, the most interesting place." "What's there?" Thomas asked, leaning closer to the map. "Officially, empty storage rooms," Selena replied. "But if you compare old plans with new ones, you can see that the 3rd floor's layout changed significantly after 1956. Previously there were several large rooms, and now a labyrinth of small chambers and one large hall." Edgar carefully studied the map, his practical mind analyzing the best movement routes. "According to my information from the cooks, Filch begins patrolling from the eastern part at 1 o'clock, he reported. "This gives us about an hour for searching. But there's a problem. I learned that some Slytherins also plan to do something at night." "What exactly?" Thomas frowned. "I don't know precisely," Edgar admitted. "But one of the house elves saw Lucius Malfoy and his friends hiding something in an empty classroom on the 2nd floor of the eastern wing." This was unexpected and unpleasant news. The Slytherins could create serious problems for their mission. "Then we need to be especially careful," Selena decided. "Let's divide into stages. First we'll check the 1st floor, make sure there's nothing there, then go upstairs." They carefully descended through corridors to the castle's eastern part. Here the atmosphere was completely different. The air seemed thicker, and the shadows deeper. The stone walls were covered with ancient moss, and the windows were overgrown with ivy, through which moonlight barely penetrated inside. The first floor greeted them with a row of empty classrooms with dust-covered desks and blackboards. Thomas checked each room using a simple spell for detecting hidden objects, but the result was negative. Selena meanwhile studied the walls, searching for hidden passages or unusual symbols she had seen in her vision. "There's nothing here," she whispered after they had checked the last classroom on the first floor. "Let's go upstairs." The stairs to the second floor creaked under their feet, despite all the muffling spells. Every sound seemed deafeningly loud in the night silence of the castle. When they reached the second floor, Edgar suddenly raised his hand, signaling to stop. "I hear voices," he whispered barely audibly. Indeed, muffled voices were coming from one of the corridors. The three friends carefully crept closer and saw a strip of light under the door of one of the rooms. The voices became clearer. They were Slytherins. "Professor Slughorn says that Dumbledore keeps the most valuable things in," came Lucius Malfoy's voice. "Quiet," someone else interrupted. "What if someone hears?" "There's no one here, Crabbe," Lucius replied disdainfully. "Everyone's asleep, as they should be." Thomas, Selena, and Edgar exchanged glances. The Slytherins were clearly also searching for Dumbledore's treasures, and they had information from Professor Slughorn. "We need to find out what they know," Thomas whispered. Selena nodded and carefully drew her wand. She knew an eavesdropping spell that would allow them to hear the conversation more clearly without approaching the room. "Amplificare susurros," she silently mouthed, directing her wand at the door. The Slytherins' voices became much clearer. "So Professor Slughorn mentioned that Dumbledore was particularly interested in alchemy and the transformation of metals," Lucius was saying. "He thinks the headmaster might be storing the results of his experiments somewhere in the castle." "Why don't we just ask him?" muttered a thick-voiced young man, probably Gregory Goyle. "Because Goyle," Lucius patiently explained, "some things are better taken than asked for, especially when it comes to such valuables." "And where will we search?" asked a third voice belonging to Vincent Crabbe. "On the third floor," Lucius replied. "There are several rooms there that never open. Professor Slughorn said he saw Dumbledore going there with some strange packages." The three friends exchanged worried glances. The Slytherins planned to go exactly where they were going. "We need to act faster," Edgar whispered. "While they're talking here, let's go to the third floor." They carefully bypassed the room with the Slytherins and climbed the stairs to the third floor. Here the atmosphere became even more mysterious. The corridors were narrower, the ceiling lower, and the air thicker. Portraits hung on the walls, most of which were sleeping, but some watched the uninvited guests attentively. "Who goes at such a late hour?" asked the portrait of an old wizard in a green hat. "Quiet, Sir Cedric," Selena quickly replied. "We're here on Professor Flitwick's errand, checking castle security." The portrait didn't seem very convinced, but nodded and fell silent. The third floor indeed proved to be a labyrinth of small rooms and narrow corridors. Selena checked their route against the map, trying to find the large hall that had appeared after the 1956 renovation. "It should be somewhere here," she whispered, pointing to the end of the corridor, where a wall seemed to block the passage. Thomas approached the wall and carefully examined it. At first glance, it was an ordinary stone wall covered with the same moss as the rest of the eastern wing. But when he brought his wand closer, he felt weak warmth emanating from the stone surface. "There's magic here," he informed his friends. "This isn't a real wall." Selena approached closer and began carefully studying the surface. Suddenly she noticed barely visible contours of symbols carved into the stone. "Look," she whispered with excitement. "These are the same symbols I saw in the vision." Indeed, ancient magical signs were carved on the wall, barely standing out on the stone surface. They formed a complex pattern that resembled a combination of runes and alchemical symbols. "What do you think this means?" Edgar asked, trying to decipher the symbols. "It's a protective spell," Selena answered after a minute of thought. "But not an ordinary one. Different magical traditions are combined here. Look, this rune means preservation, this one, wisdom, and this alchemical symbol indicates transformation." Suddenly they heard footsteps in the corridor behind them. Someone was climbing the stairs to the third floor, and these weren't Slytherins. The steps were too heavy and decisive. "Filch," Thomas whispered in panic. Indeed, the characteristic sound of the caretaker's keys and his muttering under his breath came from the corridor. Mrs. Norris was probably with him too. Sometimes the quiet sound of cat paws on the stone floor could be heard. "We need to hide," Selena whispered, looking around. But there was nowhere to hide. The corridor was narrow and empty, and all the doors they had checked were locked. "I have an idea," Edgar said quickly. "Selena, can you create an illusion?" "What exactly?" the girl asked, not taking her eyes off the symbols on the wall. "A disorientation spell. Make Filch think he heard sounds from the other direction." Selena nodded and quickly spoke a complex spell, directing her wand in the opposite direction. After a moment, a sound like falling books came from that side. "What's that there?" Filch muttered, and his steps turned in the other direction. "Mrs. Norris, check that corridor." While the caretaker was distracted, Thomas focused again on the wall with symbols. He remembered a recognition spell he had studied in his brother's collection and decided to try it. "Revelar secretum," he whispered, touching the central symbol with his wand. Suddenly the symbols flashed with soft golden light, and the wall began to slowly part like doors. Behind it opened a long corridor illuminated by the same golden glow that Selena had seen in her vision. "Quickly," Thomas whispered, and all three rushed into the corridor. The wall closed behind them as silently as it had opened, leaving them in a long passage whose walls were indeed decorated with strange symbols. The air here was warmer and smelled of something pleasant, cinnamon, vanilla, and something else sweet that they couldn't identify. "Incredible," Selena whispered, examining the symbols on the walls. "This is real ancient magic. Some of these signs I've only seen in the oldest books on the history of spellcasting." The corridor led them deeper into the castle's eastern part, gradually widening. The golden light became brighter, and the scent of sweets more intense. "Don't you notice that it smells somehow delicious?" Edgar asked, sniffing. "Indeed," Thomas confirmed, "as if someone's cooking sweets somewhere here." Finally, the corridor led them to large oak doors that exactly matched Selena's vision description. The lock on the doors was shaped like a sun with many rays, each decorated with small alchemical symbols. "This is it," Selena whispered with excitement. "Exactly as I saw." Thomas carefully approached the lock and tried to turn it. The lock didn't yield, but when he touched it with his wand, the sun's rays began to slowly rotate. "It's a puzzle," he realized. "We need to arrange the symbols in the right order." Selena approached closer and began studying the symbols on the rays. Her knowledge of ancient magic proved invaluable. "Look," she said, "this is an alchemical sequence of transformation. If we arrange the symbols in the order earth, water, air, fire, and then add the planetary symbols in the correct sequence." She carefully began turning the rays, setting the symbols in the required order. When the last symbol fell into place, the lock clicked, and the doors slowly opened. Behind the doors opened a large room illuminated by soft, warm light from countless candles burning in the air without any support. But most impressive was what filled the room. Along the walls stood tall wooden shelves filled with hundreds of glass jars, boxes, packets, and other containers of various shapes and sizes. All of them contained something colorful and bright, red, blue, green, golden substances that sparkled in the candlelight. And in the middle of the room stood a large wooden table on which lay various instruments resembling equipment for making sweets. "What is this?" Edgar whispered, entering inside and looking around. Thomas approached the nearest shelf and read the labels on the jars. Acid Pops, improved formula, chocolate frogs, experimental, pepper imps, extra hot version. "These are sweets?" he asked in surprise. Selena took one of the boxes and read the inscription on it. "Bertie Bott's Every Flavor Beans, Professor DS Secret Recipes." "Merlin's Beard," she whispered. "These aren't treasures in the usual sense. This is a laboratory for creating magical sweets." Suddenly they heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor behind the doors. But these weren't Filch's heavy steps. Someone was walking lightly and confidently, as if they knew this path by heart. "Someone's coming," Thomas whispered. "We need to hide." But there was nowhere to hide. The room was large but open, and the shelves didn't provide sufficient cover. The footsteps approached, and suddenly in the doorway appeared a figure in a long nightgown and slippers. A long silver beard, half-moon spectacles, and kind, though slightly surprised blue eyes, Professor Dumbledore himself. "Well, well, well," he said in a gentle voice, entering the room and closing the door behind him. "It seems my nocturnal visits are no longer a secret." The three students froze as if spellbound. They had been caught red-handed and now didn't know what to do or say. "Professor, we can explain everything." Thomas began to stammer. "Oh, I'm sure you can," Dumbledore smiled, approaching one of the shelves and taking a jar with bright green sweets. "But first, perhaps one of you would like to try some mint frogs? This is my new development. They give a feeling of freshness for a whole week." The strange turn of events completely bewildered the students. They had expected punishment, expulsion, at least a stern lecture, and instead they were being offered experimental sweets. "Professor," Selena began carefully, "we didn't mean to. That is, we were just curious." "Of course, you were curious," Dumbledore nodded, placing the jar on the table and turning to them. "Curiosity is a wonderful thing, Miss Ravenscroft, especially when it's combined with cleverness, as in your case." He knew their names. Of course he knew. He was the headmaster. "Mr. Winterbourne," Dumbledore continued, addressing Thomas, "your recognition spell was performed flawlessly. And you, Mr. Tudge," he looked at Edgar, "demonstrated excellent information-gathering skills. House elves greatly respect those who treat them with kindness." You knew we were looking for this place?" Edgar asked, still unable to believe the reality of the situation. "My dear boy," Dumbledore smiled, sitting in a comfortable armchair that stood by the table, "I know about everything that happens in my castle, especially when it concerns such determined and inventive students as you three." He took a box of chocolate sweets from the shelf and offered it to them. "Please help yourselves. These are chocolate trolls. They give a feeling of strength and confidence. Very useful after such a nerve-wracking adventure." Thomas carefully took a sweet and tried it. The taste was incredible, richer and more complex than any chocolate he had ever tasted. And indeed, almost immediately he felt tension and fear recede, replaced by calm and confidence. "Professor," he said when the sweet melted, "why aren't you angry with us? We broke rules, wandered the castle at night, broke through your protective charms." "Broke through?" Dumbledore asked in surprise, raising his eyebrows. "Oh no, my dear boy. No one broke through my protective charms. They simply recognized in you those who are truly interested in magic for the sake of knowledge, not for power or gain." He stood and approached one of the shelves where particularly beautiful jars with sweets that shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow stood. "You see, children," he continued, "true treasures don't always look like gold or precious stones. Sometimes the most valuable thing is what brings joy to other people." "But why sweets specifically?" Selena asked, her research mind still trying to understand the logic of what they had seen. Dumbledore turned to them with a warm smile. "And why not?" he replied. "Aren't sweets one of childhood's greatest joys? Aren't they capable of cheering the sad, encouraging the weary, uniting the quarreling?" He took a particularly bright jar from the shelf and showed it to the students. "These sweets, for example, help people better understand each other. And those," he pointed to another shelf, "calm fears and anxieties. Magic can be not only destructive or protective. It can be delicious." Edgar suddenly understood. "You create these sweets for students? To help them? Clever, Mr. Tudge." Dumbledore nodded approvingly. "Yes, some of my creations appear on the Great Hall tables during particularly difficult periods of the school year. Exam time, for example, or after unpleasant incidents when the entire castle needs a bit of extra joy." "And do other schools know about this?" Thomas asked. "Oh, I sometimes share my recipes with colleagues," Dumbledore replied. "Professor McGonagall particularly loves my ginger biscuits that add determination, and Madame Pomfrey often requests sweets that speed recovery." Suddenly they heard distant noise. These were the voices of Slytherins who had apparently also found their way to the third floor. "Ah, our Slytherin friends have finally reached their goal," Dumbledore said calmly. "Interesting how they plan to overcome my protective charms." "And what will happen to them?" Selena asked worriedly. "Nothing special," Dumbledore replied with a slight smile. "My charms are quite intelligent. They only allow passage to those guided by sincere curiosity, not greed or desire to possess what belongs to others. I think our Slytherin students will spend the rest of the night trying to solve symbols that will constantly change before their eyes." As if confirming his words, frustrated voices and the sound of retreating footsteps came from the corridor. "And now," Dumbledore said, returning to the three friends, "I think it's time to answer the main question. What are you going to do with this knowledge?" The three students exchanged glances. This was indeed an important question. They had found what they were looking for, but now they understood it was completely different from what they had expected. We won't tell anyone," Thomas said quickly, "if you don't want others to know." "And why not?" Dumbledore asked in surprise. "Should creating joy be a secret?" "But then all students will start coming here," Selena noted, "and the atmosphere of mystery will disappear." Dumbledore thoughtfully stroked his long beard. "Wisely said, Miss Ravenscroft. But you forget about my protective charms. Only those who are truly interested in magic for the sake of knowledge and good, not for personal gain, will be able to get here. He approached the large table and took an unusual instrument resembling a mixture of a copper cauldron and a glass tube. "Would you like to see how this works?" he asked with a twinkle in his eyes. Without waiting for an answer, he began adding various ingredients from jars and bottles to the cauldron. Brownish root powder, drops of golden essence, a pinch of violet dust. The air filled with a pleasant aroma, and a thick, iridescent mass began to appear in the cauldron. "This is the base for caramel clouds," Dumbledore explained, stirring the mixture with a thin glass rod. "They help people see the good in those around them better." "And how did you know we were looking for your treasures?" Edgar asked, fascinated by the process of creating magical sweets. "Oh, my dear boy," Dumbledore smiled. "Why do you think your teachers so willingly shared information? Professor Kettleburn, Professor Slughorn. They all knew I was interested in how students react to mysteries." "You deliberately gave us clues?" Selena asked in surprise. "I didn't give them," Dumbledore objected. "I simply didn't interfere with the natural course of events. Curiosity is the best motivator for learning, isn't it?" The mass in the cauldron began to rise in light bubbles that burst with quiet melodic sounds. "Almost ready," Dumbledore muttered, adding the last drop of some silvery liquid. "And now the most important ingredient." He raised his hands to the cauldron and quietly whispered some spell. Suddenly the mass blazed with soft light, and small, cloud-like pieces of caramel began to float out of the cauldron, slowly rotating in the air. "Incredible," Selena whispered, watching the dance of caramel clouds. "Magic becomes truly beautiful when it's used to create happiness," Dumbledore said, carefully collecting the clouds in a glass jar. "That's why I created this place. Not to hide treasures, but to create them." He turned to the students and looked at them carefully. "But now I have a proposal for you," he said. "You've shown cleverness, courage, and most importantly, sincere desire to learn. How about occasionally helping me here?" "Helping?" Thomas repeated, not believing his ears. "Of course," Dumbledore nodded. "Mr. Winterbourne, your courage would be useful for testing new recipes. Miss Ravenscroft, your knowledge of ancient magic would help improve the creation processes. And you, Mr. Tudge, have a natural sense of what will truly bring joy to people." "But this has to remain a secret?" Selena asked. "Not a secret," Dumbledore corrected. "Simply, special knowledge possessed only by the chosen. And remember, the best treasures are those that can be shared with others." Suddenly voices came from the corridor again. But this time they were heavy, decisive steps of Mr. Filch, who had apparently learned about the nocturnal activity in the castle's eastern part. "Oh, our friend Mr. Filch doesn't like it when students violate curfew," Dumbledore said with a slight smile. "Perhaps we should help you return to your common rooms in a more discreet manner." He approached one of the walls where among the symbols he found a special sign and touched it with his wand. Suddenly a small passage appeared in the wall, from which warm air wafted. "This tunnel will lead you directly to the kitchens," he explained. "From there you can easily reach your rooms without encountering Mr. Filch." "Professor," Thomas said before entering the tunnel, "why do you trust us?" Dumbledore looked at him with warmth in his blue eyes. "Because, my dear boy, you sought treasures not to appropriate them, but to understand the mystery. And this means you have the right priorities." "And when can we return?" Selena asked, obviously already planning the next visit. "Any night when your curiosity outweighs your need for sleep," Dumbledore replied. "But remember, knowledge gained at night should bring joy during the day." They entered the tunnel one by one, which proved to be warm and cozy, lit by the soft glow of magical crystals. Behind them came Professor Dumbledore's voice. "And tomorrow at breakfast, pay attention to the jam. I decided to add some of my caramel clouds to it." The tunnel led them directly to the kitchens, where house elves were preparing dough for tomorrow's bread. The elves nodded to them friendly, as if students' nocturnal visits were quite ordinary, and showed them the best paths to their house rooms. Selena was first to reach Ravenclaw Tower, where the bronze eagle asked her the usual riddle question. But today even the most complex riddles seemed simple after everything they had experienced. Edgar easily passed to the Hufflepuff basement, where the fireplace's warmth and the smell of fresh rolls from the kitchens created an especially cozy atmosphere. Thomas was last to reach Gryffindor Tower, where the fat lady complained to him about some Slytherins who had wandered the corridors all night and disturbed decent people. Lying in their beds, each of them thought about the incredible night they had experienced. They had found Dumbledore's treasures, but it turned out that the real treasure wasn't gold or magical artifacts, but the ability to bring joy to other people. And in the distant room of the castle's eastern part, Professor Dumbledore was still working on his magical sweets, occasionally smiling at memories of three inventive students who reminded him that the best adventures begin with simple curiosity. Beyond Hogwarts windows, the first glimmer of dawn painted the sky in pink and golden hues, promising a new day full of opportunities for new discoveries. The morning sun broke through thick clouds that had gathered overnight above Hogwarts, painting a mosaic of light and shadow on the castle walls. October wind carried fallen leaves through the corridors that crept in through open windows, and the air smelled of rain and autumn flowers from Professor Kettleburn's greenhouses. The three friends met for breakfast in the Great Hall, trying to behave naturally, though each of them felt a special excitement after the previous night's adventure. Thomas sat at the Gryffindor table, but his attention constantly slipped to the staff table, where Professor Dumbledore was calmly having breakfast, occasionally smiling at something Professor McGonagall was saying. The headmaster looked absolutely ordinary, as if nothing special had happened the previous night. Only when their gazes met did Dumbledore barely perceptibly nod and wink, causing Thomas's heart to quicken. Selena at the Ravenclaw table tried to concentrate on reading the Daily Prophet, but the words blurred before her eyes. She still couldn't believe in the reality of what had happened. Magical sweets, a secret laboratory, Dumbledore's proposal to become his assistants. All of this seemed like an incredible dream. Edgar at the Hufflepuff table methodically ate his porridge with honey, but his green eyes constantly searched for his friends among the crowd of students. He noticed that Lucius Malfoy and his companions looked particularly gloomy this morning. Apparently their nocturnal expedition hadn't brought the expected results. Suddenly an owl approached Edgar's table with a small parchment tied with a golden ribbon. The Hufflepuff recognized the headmaster's handwriting immediately, elegant, somewhat old-fashioned letters written in emerald ink. "Dear mystery researchers," was written on the parchment. "If your curiosity about creating joy hasn't disappeared after one night, I invite you today after the last lesson to my office to discuss one interesting project. Password, honey cakes. Respectfully, AD." Edgar carefully showed the note to Thomas and Selena when they passed each other between lessons. The excitement was so strong that the day seemed endlessly long. Lessons dragged on, professors spoke as if from behind a thick wall, and thoughts constantly returned to what might be waiting for them. Finally, the last bell rang, and the three friends hurried to the headmaster's office. The stone gargoyles guarding the entrance to the office obediently moved aside upon hearing the password, and the moving staircase carried them up to the familiar oak doors. Dumbledore's office always impressed visitors with its unusuality. The walls were lined with bookshelves, between which hung portraits of former headmasters, most of whom dozed in their frames. Silver instruments of various shapes and purposes stood on small tables, quietly gleaming and occasionally emitting small clouds of colored smoke. And behind the large wooden desk sat Dumbledore himself, carefully examining something through a magnifying glass. "Ah, here are my nocturnal wanderers," he said welcomingly, raising his head. "Please sit down. I hope you slept well after yesterday's adventures." "Not very well," Thomas honestly admitted, settling into one of the soft armchairs. "Too many impressions." "That's quite understandable," Dumbledore smiled. "First acquaintance with the magic of creation is always exciting. And now to business." He stood and approached one of the cabinets, from which he pulled out a medium-sized wooden box decorated with the same symbols they had seen yesterday in the corridor. "I have your first real assignment," he said, placing the box on the table. "If, of course, you're ready to become not just observers, but active participants in the process of helping others." The eyes of all three students blazed with curiosity and excitement. "What exactly needs to be done?" Selena asked, leaning forward. Dumbledore opened the box, and a pleasant aroma of vanilla, cinnamon, and something else, fresh and joyful, spread from it. Inside lay 3 small pouches of different colored fabric, each labeled with neat handwriting. Each of these pouches contains special sweets created specifically for a particular person, the headmaster explained. "Your task is to discreetly deliver them to the recipients. But this must be done so that the receiver thinks it's just a pleasant coincidence." "And who are these people?" Edgar asked, looking at the pouches. "The first," Dumbledore took the blue fabric pouch, "is intended for Aurelia Misty from Ravenclaw, 2nd year. The girl is very lonely and sad after her best friend was transferred to another school. These sweets will help her feel supported and find new friends." Selena took the blue pouch, feeling its lightness and the warmth emanating from inside. "The second pouch," Dumbledore continued, taking the red pouch, is for Reginald Timberlake from Gryffindor, first year. The boy is terribly afraid of transfiguration lessons after several failed transformation attempts. These sweets will give him confidence and help him concentrate. Thomas carefully took the red pouch, feeling something soft rolling around inside. And the third, Dumbledore handed the yellow pouch to Edgar, is for Oliver Woodburn from Hufflepuff, 5th year. He's worried about being appointed prefect. He's afraid he won't live up to expectations. These sweets will help him find balance between responsibility and self-confidence. And how should we deliver them unnoticed? Selena asked, studying her pouch. Here your creativity will be very useful, Dumbledore replied with a sly smile. Each of you knows the peculiarities of your house best. Use this knowledge. But remember, if you're caught, I unfortunately won't be able to openly protect you. Officially, this mission doesn't exist. And what if something goes wrong? Edgar asked worriedly. Then you'll learn to get out of difficult situations, the headmaster replied calmly. That's also part of education, though not from textbooks. Suddenly Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix, entered the office and perched in his place by the fireplace. His plumage blazed with golden-red fire, and his intelligent dark eyes carefully surveyed the students. Fawkes reminds me of an important detail, Dumbledore said, stroking the bird. Be especially careful with the Slytherins. Mr. Malfoy and his friends are still trying to figure out what's happening. They might be watching you. This was a serious warning. Lucius Malfoy was known for his cunning and persistence. How long do we have to complete the assignment? Selena asked. Until tomorrow morning, Dumbledore replied. Each of the recipients needs these sweets right now. Aurelia spent the whole day alone in the library today, reading letters from her friend. Reginald has a difficult transfiguration test tomorrow, and Oliver is holding his first meeting as the new prefect this evening. The students exchanged glances, understanding the importance and urgency of the task. We're ready, Thomas said decisively, and his friends nodded in support. Excellent, Dumbledore smiled. Then let's start with planning. Selena, how do you think you'll approach Aurelia Misty? Selena thought, turning the blue pouch in her hands. Aurelia often sits in the library by the large window on the second floor, she said slowly. She likes looking at the lake. I could arrange for the pouch to accidentally appear near her favorite spot. Clever, Dumbledore approved. And you, Mr. Winterbourne? Reginald often sits in the Gryffindor common room until late, preparing for lessons, Thomas said. I could slip the sweets into his textbooks when he goes to dinner. Also good, the headmaster nodded. Mr. Tudge? Oliver is probably in the Hufflepuff common room now, preparing for the meeting with younger students, Edgar mused. I could leave the pouch among his things with a note from an anonymous supporter. Perfect, Dumbledore said with satisfaction. Now the most important thing, what to do if you're noticed. Act naturally, Selena said. Pretend we're just walking around the castle. And if they ask what's in the pouches, Thomas added, say they're gifts from anonymous friends, Edgar suggested. Technically that's the truth. Very wise, the headmaster agreed. And now, final advice. These sweets aren't ordinary. They react to the emotions of whoever touches them. So handle them carefully and with good intentions. The students carefully hid the pouches under their robes and prepared to leave. I expect a report tomorrow evening here, Dumbledore said in farewell. And remember, true magic isn't about impressing others, but about helping them feel better about themselves. They left the office, feeling both excitement and responsibility. Their first real mission awaited them, and each understood how important it was to perform it correctly. Selena was first to separate from her friends, heading to the library. The October sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows in the castle corridors. The library at this time was peaceful. Most students had gone to dinner or were preparing for tomorrow's lessons. Aurelia Misty sat in her favorite corner by the large window, which offered a view of the lake and the forbidden forest. The girl looked very lonely. Her auburn hair fell across her face, and in her hands she held a letter she was obviously rereading for the umpteenth time. Selena carefully approached a neighboring shelf, pretending to look for a needed book. She noticed that Aurelia occasionally wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. The Ravenclaw's heart clenched with pity. The girl was truly suffering. Waiting for a moment when Aurelia turned to the window, Selena quickly approached her table and left the blue pouch near the stack of books, making it seem as if it had fallen from one of them. Then she quickly moved to another section of the library, but remained within sight to see the girl's reaction. Aurelia returned to the table and looked at the pouch in surprise. "What is this?" she asked herself quietly, carefully taking it in her hands. As soon as her fingers touched the fabric, the pouch glowed softly, and tiny sparkles like stardust appeared from it. Aurelia untied the pouch in wonder and found inside small sweets shaped like butterflies that shimmered with silvery light. A small note was attached to the pouch. For one who has a kind heart. True friends always find each other, even across distance. Aurelia read the note and smiled for the first time all day. She carefully took one sweet and put it in her mouth. Almost immediately her face brightened, and warmth appeared in her eyes. Selena, watching from behind the shelf, felt her own heart fill with joy. Dumbledore's sweets truly worked. Meanwhile, Thomas was waiting in the corridor near Gryffindor Tower for Reginald to go to dinner. The first year indeed looked upset, his round face was gloomy and his shoulders slumped. Thomas heard Reginald muttering to himself about horrible transfiguration and impossible transformations. When Reginald finally went to the Great Hall, Thomas quickly slipped into the Gryffindor common room. He found the place where the first year usually prepared for lessons, a small table in the corner by the fireplace, covered with transfiguration textbooks. Thomas carefully placed the red pouch between the pages of the textbook, Fundamentals of Magical Transformation, so it would be noticeable when Reginald opened the book. He attached a note to the pouch, for a brave heart that doesn't give up in the face of difficulties. Every great wizard was once a beginner. Reginald returned from dinner half an hour later, looking even more dejected. He sat at his table and opened the textbook, preparing for tomorrow's test. Seeing the red pouch, he was initially frightened. He thought it was some joke by his classmates. But when he read the note and carefully untied the pouch, his eyes widened in surprise. Inside lay sweets shaped like little lions that glowed softly with golden light. "Incredible," Reginald whispered, taking one sweet. As soon as the sweet touched his tongue, Reginald felt pleasant warmth spread through his body. His shoulders straightened and his face brightened. He looked at the textbook again, and suddenly the content that had seemed so complex began to appear understandable and logical. "I can do this," he said to himself, and for the first time in many days his voice sounded confident. Thomas, who was watching from behind a large armchair, smiled. Mission accomplished successfully. Edgar, meanwhile, was making his way to the Hufflepuff common room, where Oliver Woodburn's meeting with younger students was to take place. Oliver, a fifth year with dark hair and serious green eyes, indeed looked nervous. He paced the room, shuffling through some notes, and occasionally stopping by the mirror to adjust his robes. Edgar waited for a moment when Oliver turned to the fireplace and quickly placed the yellow pouch on the table near his notes. The note was brief. "A true leader isn't one who never doubts, but one who finds strength to continue despite doubts. You'll manage." When the younger students began gathering for the meeting, Oliver returned to the table and saw the pouch. "What's this?" he said in surprise. One of the third years looked at the pouch. "Someone probably left you a gift, Oliver." Oliver read the note and smiled softly. He untied the pouch and saw inside sweets shaped like tiny suns that emitted warm yellow light. "Very kind," he said, taking one sweet. As soon as the sweet melted in his mouth, Oliver felt the tension leave his shoulders. His voice became firmer and his smile more confident. "Well then, friends," he told the younger students, "let's begin our meeting. I have many interesting ideas for improving our house life." Edgar, listening from the corridor, nodded with satisfaction. His mission too had been successful. When all three friends met late in the evening in the astronomy classroom to share their impressions, each of them glowed with satisfaction. "It was incredible," Selena said. Seeing Aurelia smile, she really began to look less lonely. "And Reginald completely changed," Thomas added. "When I passed Gryffindor Tower a couple of hours later, he was still sitting with his textbooks, but no longer looked frightened." "Oliver transformed too," Edgar shared. He spoke to the younger students so confidently, as if he'd always been a leader. Suddenly they heard footsteps in the corridor, but this time they weren't Filch steps. Someone was walking lightly but hurriedly. "Let's hide," Thomas whispered, but it was too late. Lucius Malfoy's head peered into the classroom doorway, followed by Crabbe and Goyle. "Ah, here's where you're hiding," Lucius said with a cold smile. "Interesting what three students from different houses are doing together so late in the evening." "Preparing for an astronomy exam," Selena quickly replied, pointing to an open book that happened to be lying on the table. "Together?" Lucius asked skeptically. "How unusual." "What are you doing here, Malfoy?" Thomas asked sharply. "Taking a walk," the Slytherin replied indifferently. and noticing strange things. For example, that some students receive mysterious gifts, and that these gifts appear exactly when you three are nearby. The friends' hearts stopped. Lucius was watching them. "I don't know what you're talking about," Edgar tried to deny. "Oh, I think you do," Lucius smiled. "But don't worry. For now it's just observations. But I'll find out what you're hiding. It's a matter of time." The Slytherins left, leaving the three friends in anxious silence. "He knows," Selena whispered. "Not everything, but something. We need to be even more careful," Thomas said. "And definitely tell Dumbledore." "Or stop," Edgar suggested worriedly. "No," Selena said decisively. "You saw how these sweets work. How many people we can make happier. We can't stop because of Malfoy." "Selena's right," Thomas supported. "We'll just be more careful." They dispersed to their rooms, each pondering the day's events. The first mission had been completed successfully, but now they knew their secret was under threat. Lucius Malfoy was a dangerous enemy, and his suspicions could create serious problems not only for them, but for Dumbledore himself. But despite everything, each of them fell asleep with a smile, remembering the joy on the faces of Aurelia, Reginald, and Oliver. Dumbledore's true treasures really worked, and this gave strength to continue, despite all the dangers. And in the distant room of the castle's eastern part, Professor Dumbledore was still working on new recipes, occasionally smiling when echoes of joy and laughter from various parts of the castle reached him. His young assistants had justified his trust, and this was the best reward for the long hours of work creating little miracles. Beyond Hogwarts' windows, the October night wrapped the castle in its soft darkness, and the stars above the towers promised new adventures for those who had the courage to seek them. Thus concluded the first adventure of three friends in the world of Dumbledore's hidden treasures. But this was only the beginning of their secret missions aimed at creating joy and hope in the hearts of those who needed it most. For true treasures aren't gold or magical artifacts, but moments of happiness we can give to one another.